In the final part of this sardine cans tutorial, we're going to set up the scene, set up materials for our object. The first thing that I want to recommend that you do is come up to Edit, and we're going to come down to Preferences. And in add-ons, I would highly recommend that you install this Edit Instance Collection add-on. This is such a wonderful add-on that allows you to edit instances of a collection so much more easily than you can without that function enabled. We're going to come over and note that I do have the collection here with our 4 components that comprise the sardine can, and as part of the start file, I've got 3 empties in place, which are just going to demarcate where it is that we want to have the post instances of the sardines can. I'm going to come over, select Sardines Can, and then we're going to bring up a context menu that's going to say Instance to Scene. But before we can invoke that, we need to understand where it is that our cursor is, because it's going to create an instance at the position of the cursor. And what's also critical to understand is it's going to look at the position of our collection of objects relative to the world's origin. So coming back into the top view, when we select this empty, press Shift and S and do cursor to selected, and you can see the cursor move there. Then when I come over to the sardine cans, bring up the context menu, we're going to do instance to scene, and there you can see that instance pop to that location. And I've just determined that this is a very useful layout. That's why I'm doing it. You don't necessarily have to do this. I think if I come over here to the empty that it's attached to, it's a little bit too big. So I will drop that to 5. In rotation, I'm going to grab this and rotate it so it aligns with that empty. Let's do the same thing over here. We'll select this empty, Shift S, cursor to selected, come back up to sardine cans, bring up the context menu, and then do an instance to scene. And then we'll take and rotate this and align it to that empty, pretty close like that. Now, this original source object, we're going to turn that off. I'm going to collapse that and we'll just turn off that little checkbox. And that means we don't have to worry about trying to pose that native data. We can leave it in its exact original orientation and position and all of that, which is really nice. What I want to do next is position one here, but the third one is actually going to be resting kind of partially on top of this. So I will take this, press Option D to duplicate that and just kind of move it up there. Select this empty, Shift S, cursor to selected, and then we'll take this and do Shift S, do selection to cursor to move it there. Its orientation isn't what I want. I'm going to press Option Z so we can see through, and I'll rotate this so it's basically at a perpendicular orientation to the second can. If we rotate this, you can see that they're intersecting with each other, and I really want it to be actually rotating as if it's laying down on it. So we're going to do something kind of cool. I will select both of these, press the question mark, and that's going to drop us inside of their own little working environment. Let's change the empties that are attached. Let's change these to 5 because they're just enormous and they're kind of obnoxious. Note that because of their orientation, we don't have any standard view that we can look at these easily. So if I switch from global to local, we can see the axis change to match the orientation. And we can do something kind of clever. Let's say this, if I come into the front view, the rotation makes it so I'm not matching up in a way that I can use the view as an easy rotation for the top one. So I will come up to View, and I'm going to do Align to View, Align View to Active, and then we're going to do Left, and look at that. It's now aligned the view to the object. And what that does for me is allow me to take this object and rotate it in a very easy and predictable way. And then we can do something else that's cool. If we take a look at this, it's not quite resting on here. If I look at the bottom is pretty close. In fact, I'm going to press the R key and I'm going to rotate that so it's intersecting a little bit. We don't have subdivision turned on. And when we have subdivision turned on, the subdivision will round a little bit, which is why I'm going to take and allow it to intersect. But now we come up here and I could just press the G key and kind of move this, but it's freeform. And I've just paid close attention to that angle at the bottom. And I really only want to move this left to right. Well, we're in a situation where we're at this odd sort of view angle. It looks regularly ordered to us because we've aligned the view to the object. But what we want to do is come up here and switch the axis to match to view. And now I can just move this and it's going to slide parallel to the view along the view's x-axis. And I can get that matched up about like that. And we maintain the relationship to the bottom left corner. Now press the question mark to return back to the scene, Option Z. And there we can see I've got that posed. And now let's switch back here to local. And then I can use that handle, the pivot point, to just move that and to get it into a little bit better position. So there we go. I don't need these empties anymore, so we'll go ahead and remove those. X key, top view, and I'm going to place the cursor. I'm just going to grab it and sort of move it right in the middle of the collection of objects that we have there. Shift A, we're going to add plane, Option Z to go into X-ray mode as it's called, S key to scale that up some so it's kind of bigger, Command A, Control A on the PC to apply the scale. Let's rotate the view. Tab key goes into edit mode. We're in edge, so let's select this, press the E key and then Y to constrain that to Y, E key again, Z, and we'll bring that up till it's up about there. Now this is a very simple object. Let's do this. Let's actually come over and add a subdivision surface modifier. Subdivision surface is so awesome. It's pretty low res, and because this is a really big object, we're going to set the levels to 3 for both of them. In fact, I'm going to take this and I'm going to move that back so that the backdrop is kind of angled like that. In fact, I'm going to select these 3 edges and I'm just going to move it a little bit closer in like that. Now you can see how it's rounded. It comes up and rounds around the corner points. So I'm going to select, now I'm in active tool and that means I don't have a marquee selection. So I'm going to select that vertex, hold the shift key and select these and then come up to vertex mode and we're going to do vertex crease and just begin moving the mouse and you can see those snap so that the subdivision doesn't go through those vertices, and look at that. Up until this point, I had missed a couple of components in the start file that I've added now with a collection for lights and cameras just to make this easy. So those are now present starting at this point in the video. And what I want to do is have us come in and take a look at what the scene looks like at this point. So I'm going to come over and just have us take note of the fact that we have cycles render turned on, and we want to come down to where it says world properties, and we want to set the strength to 0. That's a default amount of light energy, sort of omnipresent light energy that we don't want to be in the scene now, because we have, when I turn on lights and cameras, I'm just going to have us have those be as default parts of the scene. I'm not going to include those as part of the tutorial just to streamline this. Now, if we come over and we take a look at the camera, so press the camera and then let's turn on, I'm going to press Option Z, turn off X-ray. So when we built the backdrop, it's intersecting into our objects and we don't want that to happen. So we will come over here into the left view. That's okay. We'll just zoom down, grab this and just move it down so it's right below our objects. So now we can come back over, toggle camera, and we'll just see what this looks like. Now you see it's rendering outside of the camera, which is just a waste of processor use and GPU use. So we come up over here and we do render region only. So we really are at a point where we need to start adding materials to the scene. Let's go ahead and add a material to the ground plane that we're using. Before we switch to the shading tab, I'm going to just bring your attention to another add-on that I use that I absolutely love. It's called Synchronize Workspaces. And all it does is just make sure when you switch from one tab to another working tab that the view is the same. By default, Blender allows you to use independent view spaces for each of the tabs, which may be useful, but it also is a kind of a pain when you're trying to maintain continuity in your workflow from a visual standpoint. I did a video on it, and I'll link to it so you know where to download it and install it. It's super easy to use. So I'm going to switch over here to shading, and you can see exactly what it does. It just makes sure that this is just the way it was in the previous tab. Let's turn off the ray trace viewport, and we will make sure our plane is selected, and it is. Let's come down here to our material properties, click new, and we'll call this ground blue, something like that. I'm going to switch the material to just sort of a blue color, something that's similar to the label and is a complementary color to the silver and copper that we're going to be using for the metals. We're going to leave the defaults the way they are, specular 0.5 and roughness of 0.5. And let's take a look at what this looks like now by invoking rendering. It's nice because we're not having to worry about lights. I've got the lights set up. It's just a basic 3-point lighting type of system. But I think the roughness is a little bit too high. In fact, let me zoom in a little bit closer. And I'd like to maybe bring the roughness down to something about like that so we can see more clear-cut reflections. I think that's good right there. Now we want to jump in and take a look at adding a material to the can itself. But this is where we've got instances of a collection in the scene, and we can't directly edit the components of the instance by clicking on it. And this is a workflow problem in Blender. In order to gain access to the components in order to add a material or edit, you have to come back to the source collection, turn it on. Let's turn off rendering. Enable it, select those components, and then you can add a material or change a material or whatever. But it can really get cumbersome in very complex scenes. So one of the add-ons that I recommended that you turn on is the Edit Collection Instance add-on. By selecting this instance of the collection, I can press Control Option and C, and it'll create a new working environment that is isolated just those components. It's isolated the actual collection. I'm just going to select the components there, do a View, Frame Selected, and it'll move those into the view. And then I can select the part that I want to edit. So we're going to come over here now, and I'm going to click New. We're down in the Material Properties. Click New, and we'll call this Can Body Metal. Let's change the base color. Let's just take this to something like somewhere around 0.312, something about like that. We need to make it fully metal. And let's just take the specular up to 1.0. In metallic mode, specular means it drives glancing angles. It drives this base color up to white. That's essentially all it does. It's a subtle detail, but it is one that works in our favor from a visual standpoint. Now, the roughness, let's change this to 0.366 because that's one that I found to work pretty well. Now, in order to get back to the main scene to test this out, all you do is you come up here and you just click the X and it drops you back into the main scene. And then we can click the camera icon here to see what the camera sees, turn on rendering, and then we can see that material adjustment that we've just made. So I'm just going to jump back into wireframe. Here again, press Control Option Alt C to drop us back in. There it is. Select the tab itself, come down to material. We've already got a material that's assigned here called Can Body Metal, and we're going to go ahead and reuse that. But we're actually going to be customizing the material for this. So I want to separate this material for the tab itself. So you can see where it says to, and I'm going to click that and it'll create a new material that is specific to this object. So we'll call this Can Tab Metal, and we can just go ahead and leave that the way it is. And so I'm going to close this out, click Camera, and then we can just do a preview to see that material assigned. It's pretty cool. So let's come in now, jump back in, Control Option C. Now we're going to select this. I'm going to press Option Z to go out of X-ray mode. And we want to assign two materials to what I'm calling the can top, lid, whatever you want to call it. We want the rim to be a copper metal, and we want this inner part to be a metal, but the inner part's going to have kind of a grain to it. You can see that when I rotate the view is rotating around the center of the selection. That's actually a little bit of a challenge. So activate the cursor tool and place the cursor right about there. Press the N key and then switch over to view, and we're going to lock the view to the 3D cursor. I'll need to zoom back in, but now when I rotate the view, it rotates around that, which is very, very handy. Press the Tab key to come into edit mode, and we're going to switch over to face. Let's zoom down, double click on this edge, and we'll get the bottom rim, and then come up to select, and we're going to do more, less, more. Rotate around, press Shift R to repeat that operation until you come down to this kind of hard boundary right there. Now we're going to come over to the material properties, and we're going to add 2 material slots. The top slot is going to be assigned to these polygons. Let's create a material for that. Come down here and create a material for that. Now select the top material slot, and we're going to assign those polygons to that slot, and then do a select invert, come to the second material slot, and we will assign those polygons to that slot. So if I deselect, if I come out here and deselect, and I come up to the top one and I select those polygons, they become selected. So that's what material slots do. Likewise, if I select the second one and do a select operation, it selects those polygons. So we can assign independent materials to those. Let's come up to the top, and I'm going to call this can top rim. And we see we could edit the material here, or because we're in the shading editor, we have access to the nodes. We're going to add an image texture because I happen to have the color that we want to use as a bitmap so that we're all using exactly the same color and we're not guessing. So we'll come up here and do add image texture. We're going to open, and then in the start file, I've got a texture folder and we have a copper swatch. And then all we have to do is drive that into base color. Let's come up here and let's preview. I'm going to click to deselect all the polygons. Let's come into a 3D shaded view, and there we can see that that material has been assigned. And let's actually turn on the functions that's going to make this metallic like we did with the first material. We'll drive this up, and we'll drive specular to 100, and I think roughness we could take down something about like 373, somewhere in about that range. In fact, I think I'm going to drive that just to 0.38, just to round it off and make that roughness a nice even value. Let's go ahead and take this, because this is going to be a good starting point for the other material. Let's name this just can top. And the stacking order doesn't matter. It's just an assignment of polygons. That's all it's doing. So come back to can rim, and I'm going to marquee around those 3 nodes, bring up the context menu, and we'll copy those. Come back to can top, delete these 2 default nodes, which is the X key, and then paste those nodes. So they're going to look initially alike until we do some customization. In fact, let's go ahead now and let's turn on subdivision so we can kind of see that subdivided. I'm going to press the tab key to leave edit mode, and then we're going to close out because we're still in this separate working space. Close that out, come back to the camera view, and now we can preview this by turning on the ray trace renderer. We can kind of see what that looks like at this point before we start adding some nuanced texture. Let's jump back in. I'm going to leave ray tracing mode. Let's jump back into this. Option C, back out so we can see that. In fact, I think what I'm going to do is come over. I need to come back to the move tool. I'll select that. You see we have optimal display turned off. In fact, let's just temporarily disable from the viewport subdivision surfaces because we need to UV map this in order to get the texture to apply correctly. So we will jump over to the UV editor, and there we go. So remember, that synchronized viewports meant that this came in and it was synchronized, so it looks the same, which is nice. So there's the bitmap for the label. That's not what we're going to use. So we're going to come over here. We're just going to actually click the X to just remove that so we gain access to the UV space. And back over here in the 3D viewport, I'm going to switch over into face mode. Now, I don't need to worry so much about the rim, but we could just UV map everything all in one fell swoop. Switch over into the top view, and then let's leave perspective. In fact, let's fit this into the view pretty closely like that. Press the A key, and then we'll come over to the UV menu, and we're going to do a project from view to project the UVs. There we go. Let's press the S key to sort of get that scaled up and then move that into, there we go. Now, that's all you need to do. That's a very simple UV mapping operation. We don't need to try and unwrap anything in any sophisticated way. Let's press the Tab key, and we're going to switch back over into shaded mode. This is where we're going to start getting into some of the texturing fun. I'm going to press the N key to remove that tab to give us some screen real estate back. I will turn subdivision back on so we can see that subdivided. And we want a sort of grain pattern. When I was looking at the real objects in the store, the metal on the top had a grain, very physical grain pattern to it. The rim didn't, but the inner body did. And we're going to replicate that. So we need to come down and select Can Top. So that's what we're working on. That's good. I'm going to drag this bitmap way up here to give us some real estate. So we have a roughness value, and the roughness value is defining the overall roughness, but we can vary the roughness with the bitmap in order to give us an appearance of these striations in the metal. So the way that we do that is by noticing that our roughness value is 0.38. And if we come up to the add menu, let's do a mix. We're going to do just a basic mix. Okay, so we've got float and we've got color. If we take a look at the fact that our roughness is 0.38, let's come down to a value of B, and we look at this in a color, we can take this value and drive that to 0.38, which is the same as our roughness, and this color will represent exactly that roughness value. It's a little abstract, and so what we can instead do is switch this over to float, which was the default, and then we can type in the exact value. But what's cool is that we can also drive, instead of just a value, we can actually drive a bitmap, and Blender will convert the bitmap's color or grayscale value into actual float values that can be mixed with that. So let's do this. Let's come in, let's add another image texture, and we're going to open back to our textures, and there is this metal grain. Now, I happen to have it as, let's come over here and view the metal grain. Oh, that's not the right one. Sorry, let's try this again. I'm going to open texture, grain noise. That's what I meant. My bad. Grain noise. We're going to use the other one in just a minute. But this is just a bitmap that I generated in Photoshop, where I just created noise and then I did motion blur on it to create that right and left, and it created exactly sort of the effect that I needed. So now we can take this and drive this into A. But let's think about this for a minute. Why wouldn't I just take this and drive it directly into roughness? Because Blender is going to take all of the values here and convert them from 0 to 1, which is what we would do. We would take this from 0, which is black, all the way to 1 up here, which would be white. And we could certainly do that, but the value range would be too high and it would look kind of weird. And so what we want to do is mix this against a primary value that's going to be the main driver of the overall roughness, with this being just a little bit of a modifying factor to the main value. before we hook it up, let's do this. Let's take a look at what it looks like by visualizing it. I'm going to turn on our 3D viewport, and I'm going to take this noise and I'm going to drive it directly into material output. And that will allow us to visualize what that looks like on the object. I think I need to adjust the scale of the bitmap. The bitmap is perhaps a little bit too large relative to our surface, and those striations will look kind of clunky. We can do this in one of two ways. We could change the scale of the UV map, or we could change the scale of the bitmap relative to the UV map. Okay. Now we're about to use Node Wrangler, so if you haven't turned Node Wrangler on, it's a built-in add-on to Blender. Just go ahead and enable it if you haven't done that. Select the grain noise, press Shift and W, and add a texture setup. There we go. So we've got two more nodes. The first one, texture coordinates, is telling the texture to apply itself to the object's UV map. But of our interest, we want to look at the scale. We're going to look at the fact that the U and the V of the UV space are represented by X and Y. So if we come back over to the UV editor, left to right is U, and top to bottom is the V direction, where the whole space, the UV space, is represented as a 1.0 value, where the half distance right here is 0.5. And so let's kind of remember that. If we were to think about the half space being 1/4 of the total volume of the UV space, just sort of remember that in your mind. So let's come over here. And if we were to take the scale for all three of these, we'll just do that for ease sake, and apply a value of 2, we can clearly see that we have made that smaller. So what it has done is it has said to take the bitmap and replicate the bitmap into 1/4 of the total volume. So it would be 2 this way, which is the value we just put in, and 2 this way. So a value of 2 is actually replicating the texture for a total of 4 within our UV space. So just think about it. That's kind of what's happening. Now, if we did the opposite, if we did 0.5, it makes that bitmap really large. It's telling it to fit only half of the bitmap within the total 1.0 UV space. So it's a little bit counterintuitive when you think about it, because you would think 0.5 would be telling it to scale smaller, but it's not. It's doing the opposite. Okay, so let's take this back to 2. But what I'd like to do is take this value to 4 to really stretch it. And then you can leave Z alone because it's unused as far as the UV map goes, because the UV map is 2-dimensional. So let's think about this for a minute. Let's come over back to the UV space. So remember, Y is V. We're telling it to put 4 stacked to the top, but only 2 this direction, which has the effect of giving us a finer, more compressed representation of the bitmap on our object. Okay, so that's what it's doing. So let's come back into shading. Now that we've gotten that configured, what we want to do is actually mix it with our primary value 0.38, which defines the overall roughness. So let's turn off this. We don't need that to visualize that. Drive color into A, and then we're going to take mix and we're going to drive that into roughness. So it's simply mixing these two values together. And it's using the factor here. But I think maybe, so let's look at this. We could come over and we could drive this now into material output, and then we could visualize that. And this is going to help us to see what this value is doing. Now, if we take factor and we drive it all the way to 0, that will give all of the weight to A. It's going to make the bitmap appear as though it were just all by itself assigned into material output. But if we go the opposite direction, we take factor to 1, it's going to give it all the way to B. B is going to be all that represents for the surface. So this is why this is powerful. If we come in and we drop this down just a little bit, we can introduce a little bit of mix of this grain bitmap, which is highly contrasty, into the overall B value to give it just that little bit of variance. And that little bit of variance is still overall being governed value-wise by this lower B value, but with a little bit of You could think of it randomness in the form of these striation patterns, which are going to give it the grain pattern that we want. Okay, so that's exactly what we're doing. So that's why I'm driving it up closer to the main value here than I am, say, to the default of 0.5. But it's a nice way of introducing a bitmap into a value that then we could continue to change. If we wanted it to be rougher or sharper, all we would need to do is come down and define that value. And this mixed value here of the grain would just kind of travel along with that adjustment. Okay, so let's take this and drive the BSDF back into the surface. I'm going to close this down because remember, we're still working in this staged environment for that object. And then we can come back to the camera and preview that. And you see that little bit of detail begin to show up in the grain pattern. And it's just such a nice little detail. And we're going to use that again because we're going to add a really great detail down into this part of the can. Let's do the same thing now for the can bottom. Let's turn off rendering, select any of our instances, Control-Option-Alt-C to jump into our unique staged environment for the collection master. We will select this. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a unique way in how we're going to apply the material to this, but we're going to use the same process that we just used. So let's do this. We're going to apply this not using a UV map, but we're going to use a cubic mapping mechanism. If we come down to Object Properties, we can scroll down to where we say Viewport Display, and we can turn on an option called Texture Space. Now, I did an entire tutorial on this that you can watch to fully understand what Texture Space is doing. But what we want to do is change the value of this texture space, which is defined at the Object Data Properties level, where we come down to Texture Space, and we don't want it to be auto. Auto means it takes a bounding box and snaps it to the size of the object, which is going to compress the texture, and we want to change that. So we're going to turn off auto, and that's going to give us a value for each of these X, Y, and Z coordinates. And what we want to do is just kind of find the longest one, 0.072, and type in 0.072. And you can see that the bounding box now changes to fit that object, but it's uniform, and that's the critical thing. Let's go ahead and add our bitmap that we need. So let's take a look at this. I have a bitmap that I had found doing some searches online, and this was in one of those public domain, open source, copyright-free types of image databases, and I was looking for a metallic bitmap, and this was fantastic. I took the core of it and I replicated it and expanded it, but I haven't made it seamless, but it's pretty high resolution. It's 4K, and it's wonderful as a bitmap for defining randomness in a metallic type of a surface. So that is what we're going to import. So we're going to go our friend image texture node, open, textures, and then we have the metal grain. Let's come over here and turn this on. So we come down to metal grain. There we go. It's enormous. Drive this into the roughness. Okay, so that's what we would think that we would want to do. And let's come over here and take a look at this in shading mode. But it doesn't know quite what to do because by default, it's going to UV space, and we haven't UV mapped this yet. And let's say that you're in a situation where you just don't want to UV map something. In this case, we've got this really boxy kind of container, and so we can use a cubic type of, or often called a box type of projection, which is really fantastic. And Blender has a really neat implementation of it that's completely not obvious. What we need to do, press Shift and W, go to Add Texture Setup to add those same nodes. But again, we don't have any UV data assigned to it, so it's still not going to apply, and we're not going to see anything. What we need to do is switch it to Generated. Generated is going to take the texture space coordinates that we have right here, and it's going to use those to project the texture onto the object. And you can see it's doing a kind of a weird projection on here. Switch from flat to box. And when we do that, look at that. In fact, I'm going to come over and turn on subdivision so we can see, and there we have it. We have that bitmap wrapped to the object, but it's not technically wrapped. It's just being projected from our texture space coordinate system. But now we have a bit of an issue, because if you look very carefully, what you can see is there's a seam right here. In fact, let me rotate that around so that we can get a better view. You can clearly see that there is a seam going on. And we don't like that seam. It's clearly visible. There's a super cool function down here called blend. Let's type in a value of 0.3 and watch what happens. It magically blends that out. So now we don't have to UV map it. We don't have seams. It's just projected on the object. It's like magic, and it's wonderful. Let's move these out of the way. And I'm going to decouple this. We just get our value, which is 0.366. That's what I'm using here. So we're going to add a mix. And it's in float, so that's okay. So let's add to the B, 0.366. That's our primary value that's controlling it. And we take the color, we drive that in here. Now, just as a side note, I have actually specifically saved this, even though it looks grayscale, as an sRGB file, and I found that it works better that way. And then we'll drive this into roughness. And this is where we can actually see, if we play with this factor, we can see the effect that this has by changing it. And I want it to be up here about, I don't know, about 0.725, which is going to drive it closer to this value being the dominant expression. And there we go. So now when we close this down and we come back to our main working environment, come to the camera, and we go into render mode, then we end up seeing the expression of that grain pattern on the can metal, and it's awesome.